The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar on the British Murder Mystery Tour offered by the Oregon State University Alumni Association in partnership with Oregon State's Professional and Continuing Education Unit. I'm Greg Aronoff, the Marketing and Communications Manager here with PACE, and I'm joined by Kate Sanders, who is from the Alumni Association, and we also have Susan Shaw from the College of Liberal Arts. Welcome and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So before we get started, I'm going to share our agenda for the day. I work for Professional and Continuing Ed, which is the non-credit arm of the university. We partner with colleges across campus to offer open enrollment classes to the public on subjects ranging from professional development to gardening to cider making. And we're always excited to continue our partnership with the Alumni Association. And I'm especially excited to have Kate and Susan here today to talk about the British Murder Mystery Tour. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it off.
Hi, I'm Kate Sanders. I'm the Director of Alumni Programs and Alumni Group Travel at the Association. And welcome to today's travel talk. And yes, as we heard from Greg, we are doing this in partnership with PACE. So thank you very much, PACE, for being with us today. This afternoon, we'll be talking with OSU Professor Susan Shaw on the birth and lure of British murder mystery novels and TV crime dramas, as well as our great tour in London this coming March. For those of you who are not familiar with our travel program, I wanted to give you just a quick overview. The Alumni Association's Alumni Group Travel Program offers about 30 to 35 educational and lifelong learning tours a year. They are international and domestic group tours filled with in-depth cultural immersions, wildlife viewing, and chances to see natural wonders all over the world. OSU researchers and educators have numerous positive impacts throughout our world, and the travel program is one way to showcase these impacts. Many times, deans and professors join our tours as hosts for this added educational content. Some examples are, we had distinguished Professor Alan Mix. He hosted a tour along the Inside Passage of Alaska, which was pretty neat because that's where he actually helped to map the ocean floor. So our guests got to see firsthand all about his research. Dean Roy Haggerty traveled to Belize and Guatemala on a birding trip and a geography tour. And Dean Roberta Marinelli with the College of Earth, Oceans, and Atmospheric Sciences is going to be hosting our Antarctica trip this coming January. And it's almost sold out, which is really exciting. And of course, the reason we are here today is Professor Susan Shaw with the College of Liberal Arts. She actually created this tour, one-of-a-kind British murder mystery tour in England. You won't find it anywhere else. It was a pretty awesome partnership that we have here. So as you can see, this travel program is a way of connecting you with OSU's expertise while seeing new places. This upcoming trip to London is a great example. Travelers will have a chance to see this beautiful and historic location while learning all about the birth of crime in the murder mystery genre. This isn't an off-the-shelf trip. It was specially crafted by Susan Shaw and our tour provider, Arrangements Abroad. Susan is a professor in the College of Liberal Arts at Oregon State. She currently teaches an on-campus undergraduate feminism and pulp culture class on British murder mysteries and TV crime dramas, and a Law and Order UK British murder mystery and TV crime drama class as part of a semester-long study abroad program with Global Education Oregon's London Center. Susan also has a background in religious studies and is part of the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. She is a general editor of the New Encyclopedia of Women's Lives Worldwide and is working on a grant that seeks to improve recruiting, hiring, retaining, and advancing women in STEM and social behavior sciences at OSU. Welcome, Susan. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Great. Well, let's first talk a moment about why you wanted to create this tour, and then tell us a little bit about these British murder mysteries and crime dramas.
So I've been taking students to London for the past 15 years, and one of the classes I teach there is on crime dramas and murder mysteries, and I thought adults would enjoy this too, and so made the connection with the Alumni Association and with PACE and everybody got on board and thought it'd be a great idea.
Yeah, we're very excited.
So I thought it would be an interesting way to start is by looking at the history of the murder mystery and how that genre evolved in the UK. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the history of British murder. In 1827, Thomas de Quincey published an essay called On Murder Considered as One of the Fine Arts, and it focused on a set of killings called the Ratcliffe Highway Murders. The Ratcliffe Highway Murders were committed in 1811. At the time, there were only proto-police units, not professionalized. They were not well respected. In fact, there was a general public sense that it was improper for officials to spy on citizens. Wapping was a very rough area around the Docklands in London. The Thames River police were there, but they only dealt with theft from ships. So there was a man who lived there named Thomas Marr. He had a wife named Cecilia, a baby boy, and a 13-year-old apprentice. And they were all murdered one night with a ship's carpenter's hammer. The investigation then was horribly mishandled. In fact, local people came through the crime scene to see the bodies laid out.
That's awful.
just wait, all of this gets worse and worse. There weren't any witnesses. They overlooked the murder weapon for days and days. And then 12 days later, another massacre took place of a husband, wife, and their 12-year-old servant. And so this created panic in London. And so the police wanted to placate the public, so they wrapped up the investigation as quickly as they could and arrested a man named John Williams because he had had access to the murder weapon and he had, and I quote, acted suspiciously. Williams ended up hanging himself in prison, and so there was no trial, but the public realized with this that the policing system was simply inadequate. Londoners also ate up the details in the press, and it made the Ratcliffe murders the first mass media murders. And so the press coverage was so great that it created a new genre of murder reporting. And so in his essay, De Quincey satirized this thirst for gore, and he created the first fully formed fictional murderer. Now, each parish had a single unarmed constable who served for 1 year to make sure that there was order on the streets. In fact, the word constable first appeared in 1252. And the constable worked with the night watchman. The night watchmen were employed by the citizens of the area to make rounds, but often the criminals bribed them. And so as the city urbanized and grew, the constables and the watchmen weren't really enough to deal with serious crime. Now, people could also hire something called a thief taker. And a thief taker was an entrepreneur who would track down criminals for a fee, but they would also take bribes from the criminals. So the situation got so bad that in 1751, Henry Fielding, who was a writer and a magistrate, wrote an inquiry into the causes of the late increase of robbers. And so he started keeping a registry of robberies with information about crimes and suspicious persons, and he encouraged the public to report information to him. And this was the first time that a magistrate had tried to preempt crime rather than simply react to its consequences. So Fielding then recruited 6 constables who would stay in service permanently for a salary, and they became known as the Bow Street Runners, and they were the beginning of a professional paid police force. But people still feared a centralized police force. They thought that police forces were something that were used by an authoritarian government to oppress their own people. But finally, in 1829, Parliament passed an act establishing the Metropolitan Police Force. Responsibility was given to the Home Secretary, Robert Peel, and he developed 1,000 officers who were known as the Peelers. And the Peelers wore blue coats, not red, so as not to be confused with soldiers. The Peelers were only responsible for preventing crime, but not for solving it. In 1842, though, the Met created a department with the sole purpose of solving crimes. It was called the Detective Branch. And these officers wore plain clothes to build trust with the communities. In 1823, a man named John Turtell and 2 accomplices murdered a man named William Weir. Turtell wanted to rob Weir of a large sum of money that he was rumored to carry. So he shot Weir and he slit his throat. He then dumped his body in a pond. But then Turtell decided the pond was too close to the road, so he went and got the body and dumped it in another pond. When word got out, of course, the public ate up the news again. So one accomplice went bankrupt and his cottage was sold. People bought his possessions and the cottage became a tourist attraction. And so this circuit developed that would go from the grave of Weir to the pond to the Artichoke Inn where the body was carried and the landlord would be available to answer questions, and then to the cottage. Famous writers wrote about the murders. So Thomas de Quincey, Thomas Carlyle, Charles Dickens, Edward Bulwer Lytton, Sir Walter Scott. They took Turtell's gig to London and used it in a dramatic retelling of the murder that was called The Gamblers. And Turtell's likeness even ended up in Madame Tussauds' wax collection.
Wow.
Now, Madame Tussaud came to London from France, and she set up an exhibit on Baker Street with three themes of France, royalty, and horror. Now, horror started as the other chamber, but became the Chamber of Horrors. It contained models of guillotine heads from the French Revolution that she had made. She then added British murderers and artifacts related to them to her museum. And then after her death, the museum received a number of instruments of torture in 1872. Some middle-class people found the museum to be a little bit ghoulish, but lower and middle-class Victorians came. But if they couldn't come and if they couldn't see it, they wanted to read about murder.
Wow.
Broadsides were a single sheet printed on one side. They were widely affordable. Crime reports would first appear on a quarter sheet. Then more details would appear later on a half sheet. And finally, on the day of execution, a whole sheet appeared that recapped all of the details of the crime, plus an account of the execution. Then these broadsides would be gathered and folded into books. And then these books about old crimes would be sold when a new crime and execution happened. And the details read like today's police procedurals. Penny Bloods started in 1828 as a successor of Gothic novels. And so readers could purchase installments of 8 pages a week for a penny. The stories were usually set in the past with some semblance of relationship to real events. And they had millions of readers. They were full of blood, prisons, haunted castles, and the like. By the time of Queen Victoria, they had morphed into what we know as penny dreadfuls. Stories that contrast between good and evil, that contain violence and murder, and that reflect nostalgia for a simple rural past. In the 19th century, people began to turn stories of murder into entertainment. Ballads were written about murders. So in 1828, a woman named Maria Martin was murdered. Her murderer, William Corder, was hung and then dissected for medical students. A ballad was written about the murder. You can actually hear this online, by the way. You can hear the ballad.
We'll post that link on the travel website so you could hear it if you'd like to.
Yes, it's interesting. So the ballad was written. Copies of the ballad were distributed all over the UK, and it had the plus of having horror and a moral to it, that don't succumb to your basest instincts. Then ceramic figures of Maria and her murderer and the barn where she was buried sat on mantles as talking conversation pieces. Items specifically associated with the crime became collectibles. So things like the murder weapon or the lantern that was used by Maria's father to discover the body. A book about the murderer was made from the skin of the murderer.
Oh,
That's
too much.
His scalp was held in the collection at Bury St. Edmunds Museum, and his skeleton was kept at the Royal College of Surgeons until it was cremated in 2004. The story was also told on stage in a puppet show, and the marionettes of Martin and Corder are still in the Victoria and Albert Museum. The puppet shows were over-the-top melodrama, and they gave Victorian audiences both the thrill of ghoulishness and an outlet for condemning crime. And so the audiences left quite satisfied and safe because the murderer was safely executed. But we know people still collect murder memorabilia lest we get too judgmental. There was a postcard that was allegedly written by Jack the Ripper that sold for $30,000 in 2018.
Wow.
Newgate novels were novels that focused on the London underworld around the world of Newgate Prison, which was the site of public hangings. Charles Dickens read these as a child. And so his novel, Oliver Twist, the title is a pun on the word twist, which was the thieves' word for hanging. And so it appealed to middle-class readers who bought novels. The story linked to real life events. So the character of Nancy was a murdered prostitute killed by her husband who got away with it. And Dickens' sense of social justice is reflected in these novels. In his work, he always comes down on the side of prostitutes and women down on their luck. In 1850, Dickens began to write more about the Metropolitan Police. His articles presented the profession to the middle class and transformed the public's understanding of the detective branch into crime specialists rather than busybodies and spies. Dickens fictionalizes the Met detective into Inspector Bucket in Bleak House, the first detective novel. Inspector Bucket follows the clues and catches the murderer. Another real-life event affected Dickens. In 1849, the Bermondsey Horror gripped London. Its coverage became an escape from the fear of a very real cholera epidemic. Maria was a lady's maid who aspired to a higher kind of life. She wanted to marry this rich man she was seeing, but he only toyed with her. So she married a man named Frederick Manning, who was a failed businessman, and Maria ended up having to support them both. The rich man kept showing up at their home, and eventually they shot him and hit him 17 times with a crowbar.
Oh.
Then they put him in quicklime and buried him under the kitchen floor. Then the two of them took off in different directions, but the Met found them very quickly, and the arrest raised the prestige of the police. There are many stories in the press, especially since Maria didn't fit notions of womanhood. Her crime was not womanly behavior. Her crime was against propriety. She was cold and composed in court, and then she let go with a tirade at the verdict. She was called the Lady Macbeth of Bermondsey. Both she and her husband were hanged, and 30,000 people showed up to watch. Charles Dickens was in the crowd, and the sight turned him against hangings. And so Maria becomes Hortense in Bleak House, and she comes to stand for fear and social disorder. It's hinted that Hortense is lesbian outside the sexual control of men. And the story captures the middle-class fear that even the trusted servant could be a murderer. Maria also was captured in wax at Madame Tussauds. Wow. Then with the rise of detective fiction, public interest moved from the Penny Bloods to detective fiction, which is not concerned with retribution like the Penny Bloods, but with the solution of the crime. So fascination with murder became an acceptable middle-class Victorian pastime. Types of murders moved from the more violent stabbings and beatings to poison, particularly domestic poisoning. So arsenic was a very useful chemical in lots of Victorian items, from wallpaper color to rat killer. Often the toxic fumes in homes made people sick. Arsenic was readily available and became the poison of choice for murder. In fact, in France, they called arsenic inheritance powder. It was impossible to detect. Its effects looked like cholera.
Wow.
But then in 1836, chemist James Marsh produced a test for detecting arsenic. And the first trial to use science to detect arsenic gave rise to what was called the analytical chemist in the press. And this, of course, gave rise to the new expert profession of the medical gentleman. Now, in Victorian times, women were supposed to be pure, virtuous, and confined to the domestic realm. The only way to explain a murderous woman that she was crazed or wanton or suffering from some horrible sickness. So there was a woman named Florence Bravo who poisoned her abusive husband, but they couldn't prove it in court. And so Victorian women read her stories, knowing that their male relatives would consider their interests morbid and prurient. But her story showed them a woman who took a lover, enjoyed sex, and fought back against a violent husband and got away with it. Bravo said, "I told him that he had no right to treat me in such a way." And so her story made connections with the lives of women readers.
Wow.
The sensation novel arose in the 1860s. It was set in ordinary domestic situations, often middle and upper middle class families, in the country house or in a London flat. The crimes were especially cruel and scandalous. The best-known writer of sensation novels was a man named Wilkie Collins. The Moonstone was his best-known work. They're called sensation novels not only because of the sensational content, but also because the story was so gripping that it aroused sensations in the reader.
Wow.
These novels often showed women characters outside normal conventions of behavior. They were often bad and dangerous and full of anger, frustration, and sexual energy. And then the death of a husband comes as a release. Women escape their families through illness, madness, divorce, flight, and murder. And an interesting note in the novel Gaudy Night, Harriet Vane returns to Oxford to research a sensation novelist named Sheridan Le Fanu. Just a little bit for your trivia there. In 1860, a 4-year-old boy was killed in the Hillhouse Murder. The police weren't able to make a case, and so this led people to try to figure out who did it as they read information in the papers. And so ordinary people began to write to the police with their solutions to the crime. Detectives were also just beginning to learn to read a body and crime scene evidence. And so we first meet Sherlock Holmes in 1887 in A Study in Scarlet, and he's beating a body to determine how far after death bruises can be created. And so Holmes creates great popularity for the professionalization of forensic science. And other new techniques developing during this time were photographing criminals for future identification and taking fingerprints and body measurements.
What year was that again?
1887. The woman detective was interesting because she was an outsider in the world of policing and detection. So in 1841, Catherine Crowe's The Adventure of Susan Hopley, or Circumstantial Evidence, we meet our first woman as an amateur detective. Then in 1864, in Andrew Forster's The Female Detective, we meet the first woman professional investigator, which is interesting because real women weren't employed as police until 1918. But in these works, women step outside the expected. And what that means is they have opportunity to observe and detect unnoticed because they blend into the background and watch.
Crafty.
Jack the Ripper. We can't talk about British murder without talking about Jack. So Jack's an interesting character because his murders took place in 1888, which was a time of political turmoil, and a lot of different groups were trying to use the crimes for their own ends. It was also a time when the population had become much more literate. And so these stories were in the papers every day. So there was press coverage that just was constantly making new things come to light about Jack. And if you're really interested in Jack, there's a great website called Casebook.org, and it has everything you could possibly want to know about Jack.
And that's, what is that again? Casebook.org?
Casebook.org, yeah.
Great. Okay.
And there are 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. There's some debate that there may have been a 6th, a woman named Martha Tabram, who was murdered on August 7th of 1888. But the 5 that are agreed upon are Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. And I think it's important that we name the victims and recognize that in all this sort of sensationalism of Jack, that these were real women that were murdered. There were a lot of suspects, about 500 of them. We still don't know who Jack was. Some people thought it was Prince Albert Victor. Some thought it was a royal conspiracy. Some thought it was Jill the Ripper. Lewis Carroll, perhaps. But American mystery novelist Patricia Cornwell spent a good deal of her fortune, and she came to the conclusion that Jack was the artist Walter Sickert. But who knows?
Wow.
People are still fascinated by Jack the Ripper, and so I think the victims often get lost. And now there's this whole industry around Jack that glamorizes and fetishizes violence against women. And feminists in London have often protested the ways that Jack has sort of taken center stage. There's still a sense that because his victims got labeled as prostitutes, that they sort of had it coming, that this is about constraining women's movements. Feminists had fought for a museum for women in the East End of London about East End women, and when the museum actually came into being, it became the Jack the Ripper Museum. And so a group of feminists decapitated an effigy of the museum's owner in front of the attraction.
Wow.
And there's a brand new book that is about the women called The Five, The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper by Hallie Rubenhall. And I'm going to suggest for our trip that everybody read this so that we come together with this experience, and particularly an experience that reclaims these women and develops them as full human beings. I'm really impressed with the book and the level of research she's done. You really get a sense of what London was like for poor, vulnerable women in 1888 with the book.
Great. We'll also add that title onto the TRIP's website for some of these resources
Good.
we're learning about today in the webinar.
So after World War I, detective stories became an escape from the horrors of war. They typically had villainous murderers, but they weren't sensational. The English were still experiencing way too much sensation from war. Agatha Christie's novel, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, appeared, and it offered the orderly solution of a single murder. And so her novels, they're all about the payoff, the satisfaction that comes when the murderer gets caught and the puzzle is revealed at the end. And all the most significant writers of the Golden Age were women. Christie, Sayers, Marsh, Allingham. They were known as the queens of crime. And they wrote these domestic stories with a lot of women characters and very densely constructed plots. And in doing that, they made a claim for women's independence and their place in the world. But by the 1930s, there was a problem because these books tended to ignore what was going on in the world around them with the rise of fascism and dictators in Europe. And they had a tendency to simplify into this sort of a reactionary world where the values were simply reinforced by a solution to the crime. They also tend to be somewhat classist. For example, servants actually lacked the class to commit murder in these books, and they often were racist and anti-Semitic. But it's interesting, you see that sort of that anti-Semitic trope of the sinister Jews starts to disappear as Nazism rises in Europe, and then Jews become more sympathetic immigrant characters in the novels at that point. But all that was creating some problems by the 1930s. George Orwell wrote an essay in 1946 that lamented the loss of social agreement on murder as a serious crime with serious emotion attached. And he noted that wholesale destruction had become more interesting than a single murder, essentially as a result of the bomb. And so Orwell feared that inhuman random murder would become the future of fiction. So he wasn't wrong about a lot of things. Another genre called the spy thriller arose. So after the atom bomb and the Holocaust, as the old values crumble, the new intrigues led to the spy thriller. And so the thrill became the point. What happens next? Yeah. And this was primarily led by American writers, as was the development of the hard-boiled detective. And these rose in the U.S. in pulp magazines. And these were usually private eyes instead of professional police. And then there came Alfred Hitchcock. And Hitchcock was the antithesis of the Golden Age. And so his aim was to extract maximum fear, horror, humor from his audience, and this led to the genre of horror. And so we'll stop there because...
I loved Alfred Hitchcock. I always remember growing up when we'd go camping, my parents would play the old Alfred Hitchcock radio shows as we sat around the campfire and listened to these scary stories. It was great.
Yeah, he was brilliant. Great. He was a pig. He was horrible to the women who worked for him. Yeah. But he was a brilliant filmmaker, I have to say.
Wow, that was wonderful. Thank you for that overview. Before we dive into some questions, I did want to tell you a little bit about the tour as well. So for this trip, it's called the British Murder Mysteries Tour, and it's March 14 through the 22nd, 2020. The trip begins in London, and you stay at a courthouse hotel, which was once the magistrate's court, so it's a pretty magical place to stay. You explore the life of Jack the Ripper. You take a special walking tour of the notorious East London gangsters. You see the Sherlock Holmes Museum and some other great museums. You also stay in Oxford at an old former prison that is now an elegant hotel. It's quite pretty. The rooms are larger than a standard prison cell, but it does have a little bit of the feel of that old prison. There's a private murder mystery dinner. You get to see the filming locations of crime dramas such as Midsummer Murder and Inspector Morse, one of my favorites. You also have time to explore on your own in London and Oxford. And you can have the optional experiences if you want to see some of London's world famous theater. Some of the shows will change depending on actual filming times when we get a little bit closer to departure date. But some of the ones we're hoping are The Women in Black, The Comedy Bout, A Bank Robbery, or The Mousetrap.
You know, The Mousetrap is the longest running play in history.
Is it really?
And The Woman in Black is terrifying. Everybody screams.
Everyone screams. So those are optional if you want to do it. according to the itinerary. There's also a post extension in Dartmoor. This post extension is, you get to stay in a beautiful Bovey Castle in Dartmoor. You drive there, and on the way you get to see West Bay, and it's a private tour related to the television series Broadchurch. You'll see the police stations, cliffs, and more from this very popular crime drama. You hear behind the scenes stories of filming and discover the twists and turns along the way. You'll go to Devon, and visit Greenway, which is actually Agatha Christie's former holiday home. And then you'll check into the castle that evening for an evening at leisure. And then the next day, you depart for the Hounds of Baskervilles tour. And this is a pretty exciting tour to learn all about the story behind Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's novel, The Hound of Baskervilles. And then you'll visit the Dartmoor Prison Museum and learn about the history of the world's notorious jail, most notorious jail. And you'll have dinner then later in the castle. And then head back. So it's a little bit more of an extension for those that want to stay longer on the tour. The trip includes 7 breakfasts, 4 lunches, an afternoon tea, and 2 dinners. All the hotel stays, your transportations to and from the airports, and of course all the transportation throughout the tour. Entrance fees for all the items on the itinerary, and gratuities for your local guides and drivers. The cost of the trip is just under $6,000 per person, for 2 people in a room. There is a solo traveler price at $7,299 per person. And the extension to Dartmoor is just a little bit more after that. So now I think we can open it up to some questions about the talk. So if anyone has questions for Susan or about the trip, feel free to type them in. Greg, do you want to give them a little bit of directions on exactly where they go to type in their questions?
Yep, in the GoToWebinar, right on the right-hand side, you can go to the questions drop-down, and we can see them as they come in.
Great. There's a couple that came in ahead of time, so if we give a little time to see if folks want to type something in. Some questions received ahead of time are the meals provided beside the mystery dinner? And yes, there were the variety of the meals, mostly breakfast and lunches and a couple dinners. That also gives you a chance to explore on your own, which is nice in the evenings. Is there another similar tour scheduled at a different time of year? And why did we decide to do it in March? That's a really good question. We decided to do it in March. One is price. Because of the custom nature of this trip, to do it in summertime was very expensive. So we are trying to keep the price as low as possible for this trip. And this time of year, March, allows for that cost savings. It actually also is a great time to see cities. Seeing cities, which we call the shoulder season, is a wonderful time of year because it's not as crowded. It's not as hot touring around the different buildings, and you're going to be in and out of a lot of structures. So it's not like a heavy natural wonder tour where the tour is based outside during the majority of the tour. You'll be in and out of places. So,
well, if they're Oregonians, they'll feel right at home.
That is very true.
The weather's pretty much the same.
It'll be pretty much the same if you're an Oregonian. So it actually will be, I think, quite pleasant of a trip in March. It will be nice. And then another question was, how many of the BBC, PBS series filming sites do we see on tour? You'll see the sites for Midsummer's Murder, Inspector Morse, and the Post tour. You'll see filming sites for Broadchurch and Dartmoor. As I mentioned, the Hounds of Baskerville tour. And so that'd be good. I don't think I missed any, but
no, and just being out and around London, so many of the urban shows, you'll go past places you'll recognize from a lot of those shows.
A lot of the shows. That's great. And then another question was how much walking and how difficult is the tour? So I would place this tour on a scale of 1 to 5, about a 3. Why it's a 3 is because there'll be some guided walks around the cities. London has a lot of cobblestone streets. So if you're unstable on your feet, it might be good to have a cane or a walking stick, just because of those cobblestones can get tiring. And it can be easy to twist an ankle depending on how stable you are. But there's no hard hikes or any of that sort of thing. You definitely need to be able to get in and out of a coach. That would be good. And of course, there's assistance to help you to get in and out of a coach, and walking stairs. So it's kind of a standard European tour. If you've been on European tours before, where we'll do walking tours throughout the cities. So you'll be meandering through streets and cobblestones, up and down small hills, and then some people like to bring with them combination canes and seats. They're small, they pack easily. You can use a little walking stick, and then it folds out to like a 3-legged stool if you wanted to take a sit and take a break. And some people take those with them depending on how mobile they are. And then looks like we had one other question just came in, and that question is, where did Agatha Christie, tongue-tied, where did she live? And you said she was born in Torquay? Torquay.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, but she lived most of her adult life in London.
And she had a
yes.
country home.
Yep, she had the country home, Greenway, and that is what you'll see. I was looking online at Greenway, and it's quite a magical place. So it's a beautiful white big mansion house. It's pretty neat. And that is on the post tour. And I think those were all of our questions. Is there anything else, Susan, you would want to add about the trip or about the topic?
Well, as I said, I've done this with students, and we always have such a terrific time with it, because it helps sort of bring the stories to life. You get to see all of these places you've seen in the shows, and if you're an addict like I am for British novels and crime drama on TV, then it's just a really fun way to see the city. Even if you've been to London several times before, this is a different way of seeing it.
Oh, most definitely. Yeah, it is fun. And if you haven't been to London, you'll still see a lot of the famous sites, but you'll get this added intrigue on top of it, which is really fun. So as we were going through the webinar, we mentioned that we'll be posting some information online. And for those of you that did sign up for the webinar, I can also send you links as well. And we'll post information about that ballad, the song, online. The Book of the Untold Lives of the Women of Jack the Ripper. So we'll post information on that, as well as Susan and I will work on putting together a reading or a watch list for folks to read other books or TV shows to watch prior to the tour as well, or if you're just interested in it. Yeah. Well, I think that's all for today then. Thank you, Susan. I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us on the webinar. And Greg, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then I think that's all.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kate and Susan. That was great. I did want to provide some more information to our audience. I talked a little bit about professional and continuing education here at OSU. And the reason we like to partner with the Alumni Association and hear from our alumni is because we're often able to connect with the very widespread OSU network throughout not only the state of Oregon, but the US and beyond, and we can help provide educational opportunities for personal enrichment and professional development. Each program we offer is designed for working professionals with convenient online classes and year-round start dates. We also offer customizable team training. Again, I want to thank Kate and Susan here. We really appreciate having you. And this was great. I learned a lot. The tour sounds amazing. And with that, we'll wrap it up. So thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you on the next webinar.
Thank you.